He wrote to one of his friends that he thought he would have to marry a golden dolly, in other words, a rich heiress.
Newstead Abbey is financially draining on him. Nevertheless, he didn't behave well in relation to Newstead. He didn't look after his tenants. He wasn't a shrewd estate manager. In a sense, he was more romantically attached to it than practically. He spent a lot of money on really good decorations so he could entertain people there, but he didn't repair the roof. So when it rained, all the decorations were ruined. He wasn't practical in that sense. And he's also poor because he refuses, at least on paper, to accept money for his poems because aristocrats, gentlemen, that would turn him into someone who gets his living by writing. And he hates that idea. He hates the idea that you could see ink on his fingers. He'd be a mere writer. He's not. He's a gentleman who writes.
Knowing full well that a scandal would affect his chances of finding an eligible bride, Byron compounded his problems by launching himself into an affair with another married woman.
Lady Oxford was a brilliant political hostess, an impassioned Whig, which we would call progressive liberal element of British politics. And she wanted to inspire Byron, alone among the women in his life, to make good on his promise of political activism.
Byron had already ventured into politics at the House of Lords when he made a speech supporting the rights of weavers because mechanisation had threatened their livelihoods.
Lady Oxford was extraordinarily brilliant and tried to be his political muse. She was not interested in leaving husbands, exploiting him sexually. She wanted to have a wonderful time with him, but also to turn him into the political figure that she felt he could and should be.
But Byron was not yet ready to explore a life in politics. He was concerned with finding a wife. Financial and emotional pressures were taking their toll, but his next love would embroil Byron in the biggest scandal of his life to date. By 1813, Byron had become the celebrity bad boy, worshipped as a poet, but frowned upon as a womanizer. He needed a rich wife to wipe out his debt. However, when he was reunited with his half-sister, Augusta, his chances of marriage became even more remote.
They encountered each other as young adults. Augusta Leigh was already very unhappily married to another wastrel and gambler like their father.
She was tall and slim, had a receding chin, and also shared a lisp with Byron, so that might have been something that was attracted him. They shared good humour together, and she had a talent for mimicry, so she could actually make him laugh.
Augusta Leigh was, in my view, the love of his life. She was the only one that he ever felt who understood him, that had that kind of maternal quality of all-forgiving and unconditional love.
Although more dangerous than any of his past liaisons, it was a relationship that neither of them could control.
It was the threat of exposure about Byron's relationship with his half-sister that was the terrifying aspect to him.
The prospect of scandal was all the more worrying for Augusta. As woman of the bedchamber for the Queen, she was the main breadwinner for her children, and scandal could mean losing both them and her job. It was by now even more important that Byron should marry, and he sought out a more suitable bride, Annabella Milbank.
One of the attractions, I think, for Byron was with Annabella that she was slightly prim and she wasn't throwing her cap at him as all the other women were doing. In fact, it was Annabella who was responsible for the phrase Byromania. She wrote a little poem called The Byromania, which was about all these women throwing themselves at Byron. At the point when he felt that he needed to get out of his relationship with Augusta, with his half-sister, Augusta, in fact, encouraged him to think about marrying at that stage. He proposed again to Annabella, and she delightedly accepted.
And he did actually really think that perhaps marriage would settle him down and he could enjoy a better life. He'd had lots of affairs. He'd had his ups and downs. He'd had tantrums. He'd had the sobbing women on his doorstep. And it was perhaps time, he thought, that he would settle down and have a good life.
Annabella Milbank was probably the worst and unhappiest choice Byron could have made. She did not succeed in parting him emotionally or sexually from his sister. Rationally speaking, it was a sensible choice. She was an heiress. She was extraordinarily intelligent in terms of his views of wanting a companion. She was very clever. She turned Byron down several times. As a proposal saying that she felt they were incompatible. Would that she had only kept to that. They could not have been more incompatible.
The marriage brought the promise of a future inheritance from his bride's family, but once Annabella had become accessible, he seemed to lose interest and was cruel to her from the start.
He seems to have treated her pretty badly during their honeymoon, been, ratty and cross. She certainly looked back on it as a pretty rough time. He called it the treacle moon instead of the honeymoon.
Byron heightened the tensions in the marriage by inviting his sister to live with them. He now played a cruel game, setting the two women off against each other and hinting about his love for his sister.
What went on in the first months of their marriage is a very murky situation, but it's clear that they did, in fact, live together, whether cohabitantly or not is hard to say, but emotionally, the triad was a fraught situation. What brought the relationship and the terror of exposure to its denouement was that when Annabella produced their child, a daughter, the responsibility, the sense that he had entered into a separate and independent state of marriage, his indebtedness, he seems to have completely unhinged.
Byron, in the time when he was married, 1815 to 1816, I think was in the most wretched period of his life, where I think he drank a lot, he was worried by money, I think he was neurotic. I don't think he was technically manic-depressive, but he's closer to that kind of diagnosis at that period in his life than any other.
And he gambled and spent more on whores than he ever had done before, as his marriage was disintegrating and he was more and more miserable and simply was wheeling out of control. His whole emotional structure was falling apart.
After the birth of his daughter, Byron encouraged Annabella to leave London and stay with her parents. Initially, it was meant to be a brief separation, but safely away from Byron's clutches, Annabella confided her worries to her parents.